The News Alerts, Podcast Media. Today, live April 16, 2021. Here is the headline of the most recent news on the international scene. U.S. imposes wide array of sanctions on Russia for malign actions. The United States on Thursday imposed a broad array of sanctions on Russia, including curbs to its sovereign debt market, to punish it for interfering in last year's U.S. election, cyber hacking, bullying Ukraine, and other alleged malign actions. The U.S. government blacklisted Russian companies, expelled Russian diplomats, and barred U.S. banks from buying sovereign bonds from Russia's central bank, National Wealth Fund, and Finance Ministry. The United States warned Russia that more penalties were possible but said it did not want to escalate. The Russian Foreign Ministry reacted angrily, summoning the U.S. ambassador for a diplomatic dressing down to tell him a series of retaliatory measures will follow soon. A ministry spokeswoman also said a possible summit could be imperiled. Russia denies meddling in U.S. elections, orchestrating a cyber hack that used U.S. tech company SolarWinds Corp. (SWI), and to penetrate U.S. government networks and using a nerve agent to poison Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. U.S. President Joe Biden spoke on Tuesday to Russian President Vladimir Putin to raise concerns about those issues and the buildup of Russian forces in Crimea and along the border with Ukraine. Although a top U.S. general saw only a low to medium risk of a Russian invasion in the next few weeks, Biden, who also proposed a U.S.-Russian summit, is trying to strike a balance between deterring what Washington sees as hostile Russian behavior, while avoiding a deeper deterioration in U.S.-Russian ties and preserving some room for cooperation. My bottom line is this: there is an interest in the United States to work with Russia. We should and we will, Biden said in remarks to the press. But when Russia seeks to violate the interests of the United States, we will respond, he said. I was clear with President Putin that we could have gone further, but I chose not to do so. I chose to be proportionate. Russia said Washington's actions contradicted a stated U.S. desire to normalize relations with Moscow. The sanctions are hostile steps that heighten the country's confrontation, a Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said. Among his moves, Biden signed an executive order authorizing the U.S. government to impose sanctions on any area of the Russian economy, and used it to restrict Russia's ability to issue sovereign debt to punish Moscow for interfering in the 2020 U.S. election. Biden barred U.S. financial institutions from taking part in the primary market for ruble-denominated Russian sovereign bonds from June 14. U.S. banks have been barred from taking part in the primary market for non-ruble sovereign bonds since 2019. He did not prohibit them, however, from buying such debt in the secondary market, a step likely to have a far more dramatic effect on the Russian bond and currency markets, which fell as news of the sanctions seeped out before recovering some losses. The Treasury also blacklisted 32 entities and individuals it said had carried out Russian government-directed attempts to influence the 2020 presidential election and other acts of disinformation and interference. Analyst: Russia to continue testing U.S. In concert with the European Union, Britain, Australia, and Canada, the Treasury also put sanctions on 8 individuals associated with Moscow's occupation of Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. The White House said it was expelling 10 Russian diplomats in Washington, including representatives of the Russian intelligence services, and for the first time, formally named the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, SVR, as the perpetrator of the SolarWinds hack. The agency said the allegations were nonsense and windbaggery. The U.S. government plans a new executive order to strengthen its cybersecurity, a U.S. official told reporters, suggesting it could include such elements as encryption and multi-factor authentication. The White House also said it would respond to reports Russia had offered bounties to Taliban-linked militants to kill U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. U.S. intelligence agencies have low to moderate confidence in their assessment of those reports, in part because they rely on sometimes undependable testimony from detainees, it said. Russia has long brushed off allegations of putting bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Andrew Weiss, a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank analyst, was skeptical the U.S. sanctions would change a largely competitive and adversarial relationship in the short term or deter Russia in the long term. I'd be surprised if today's very calibrated announcements by the Biden administration materially shift the relationship in either direction, he said, saying Russia was willing to cooperate on some issues but there was unlikely ever to be a meeting of the minds on Ukraine or election interference. I don't think it's realistic to expect the new sanctions will shift Russia's risk calculus in a fundamental fashion, he added. It's to be expected that the Russians will keep probing and testing our resolve. Chauvin invokes Fifth Amendment, won't testify in defense. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin invoked the Fifth Amendment on Thursday, confirming that he will not testify in his murder trial over the killing of George Floyd. "I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today," Chauvin said during a conversation with defense attorney Eric Nelson, ending the speculation over whether the former officer would take the stand in his own defense. In questioning with Judge Peter Cahill, Chauvin confirmed that it was his decision not to testify, and that his decision was a voluntary one. The development came on the 14th day of the trial, and what is expected to be the final day of the defense's case. Chauvin faces second- and third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter charges in the death of Floyd. The former officer is charged with killing Floyd by kneeling on his neck for more than 9 minutes, which was captured on video footage in May 2020 and triggered nationwide demonstrations for racial justice. Cahill on Wednesday denied the defense's request to acquit Chauvin of the criminal charges of Floyd's murder, rejecting the defense's claims that prosecutors failed to prove that Chauvin's actions last year killed Floyd. The defense began its case on Tuesday, and has since called 7 witnesses to the stand, including a use-of-force expert, a Minneapolis Park Police officer who responded to the scene of Floyd's arrest, a former medical examiner, and a friend of Floyd who was with him when police approached his car. The prosecution rested its case on Tuesday morning after calling 38 witnesses to the stand over the course of 11 days. Testimony came from police officers, bystanders, paramedics, and use-of-force experts, in addition to Philonize Floyd, George Floyd's younger brother, who emotionally recalled the close relationship between his brother and their mother. "I miss both of them," he said, adding, "of the two, every mother loves all of her kids, but it was so unique how they were with each other." The cause of Floyd's death has been a key point of contention throughout the trial. In June, the Hennepin County medical examiner ruled Floyd's death a homicide, writing that he experienced cardiopulmonary arrest while being restrained by law enforcement. The defense, however, has argued that Floyd died from a combination of drugs in his system and his underlying heart disease. Most say not guilty verdict in Chauvin trial would be step backward for race relations. Poll. Most surveyed Americans say that a not guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with second- and third-degree murder and manslaughter for the death of George Floyd, would be a step back for race relations in the country, according to a Monmouth University poll released Thursday. 63% said that if Chauvin is found innocent on the charges, it would be a negative step for race relations. Only 5% said it would be positive, and 29% said it would not change race relations as a whole. 37% of respondents said that if Chauvin is found guilty of murder, it would be a positive step for race relations, while 12% said it would be a negative step. 46% said race relations would not change either way. Monmouth found significant differences among white Americans in their opinions based on partisan identity. Just 13% of whites who identify as or lean Republican said that a guilty verdict would be a positive outcome for race relations, compared with 56% of those who identify as Democratic or Independent. Meanwhile, 56% of white Republicans say that a not guilty verdict would negatively impact race relations, while 77% of other white respondents felt the same way. The poll was released as Chauvin's defense rested in his trial. Video of the arrest of Floyd has featured prominently in the prosecution's case against Chauvin, who knelt for nearly 9 minutes on Floyd's neck during an arrest in May. Chauvin invoked the Fifth Amendment on Thursday, meaning that he will not testify in his own trial. Closing arguments are expected Monday. Floyd's killing sparked a wave of anti-police brutality protests over the summer and sparked a larger conversation around policing in America. 36% of those polled said that the anger of the protesters regardless of their actions is fully justified, down from 57% who said so in early June. Another 30% said the anger is partially justified, while 32% said it is not all justified. Monmouth University surveyed 800 adults aged 18 and older between April 8 to 12. It has a margin of sampling error of 3.5 percentage points. Judge warns of mistrial in Chauvin case if prosecution witness even hints at newly discovered evidence. The judge in the George Floyd case rejected a request by the prosecution on Thursday to enter newly discovered evidence in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin that would have contained information about Floyd's carbon monoxide levels during his arrest, warning of a mistrial if the results were mentioned by their rebuttal witness before the jury. Judge Peter Cahill ruled against the admission of evidence, saying it was unfair to the defense. Cahill said the prosecution had an opportunity earlier to provide the evidence since it knew Fowler was raising the issue of carbon monoxide. He said allowing it now would prejudice the jury. It's untimely to give the notice and it prejudiced the defense by the late disclosure, even if it's not due to bad faith, but the late disclosure has prejudiced the defense, it's not going to be allowed, Cahill said. Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell had told the court that the state had just received blood gas evidence from Hennepin County medical examiner Andrew Baker, who performed Floyd's autopsy, that contained readings for the carbon monoxide content in his blood on the day he was arrested. The evidence, Blackwell said, was discovered after a former chief medical examiner called by the defense as an expert witness speculated in court that Floyd could have been exposed to carbon monoxide when he was pressed to the ground under Chauvin's knee near a squad car last May. Though the witness, David Fowler, said he had no knowledge of whether Floyd's blood had even been tested for carbon monoxide. He pointed to potential carbon monoxide poisoning when listing each of the factors he felt played a role in his death. Blackwell grilled Fowler, the defense's sole witness who took the stand on Wednesday, over the statements during cross-examination later that day. You agree as an expert witness that you shouldn't jump to conclusions? That is, you should reach fair conclusions based upon a careful considered analysis. Blackwell asked. Fowler agreed. Do you agree that you shouldn't come at this in a way that's biased? You agree with that, don't you? You shouldn't cherry-pick facts? You shouldn't try to confuse the jury? Blackwell continued. The tense back and forth comes as the prosecution has pointed to Chauvin's use of force against Floyd during the arrest as the cause for his death in its arguments. In its efforts to refute the prosecution's claims, the defense has instead focused on Floyd's drug use and underlying health problems as contributing factors. During comments to Cahill early Thursday, Blackwell said Baker had discovered results from tests conducted when Floyd's body was examined last year that had information related to his carbon monoxide content. Blackwell said the state had previously subpoenaed all the medical records, but it did not receive records containing the evidence in question. Dr. Baker heard the testimony, had not himself ever requested this, nor had the ER physicians. They explained that when somebody is brought in and blood gases are taken, there's a panel of them that are taken. The ones that get generated in the records would be the ones that the ER physicians actually request, he said. Nobody requested carbon monoxide readings, because they didn't see how that was relevant, he added. Did Dr. Baker spontaneously call you to tell you that there might be something deep within the computer records that was not disclosed, or did you seek him out? Cahill later asked. We did not seek him out and ask anything. He had heard the testimony and thought that this record might exist because he was aware that there's a panel of the tests that are run by the machine, he said. After ruling against the prosecution, Cahill warned of a mistrial if the state's rebuttal witness, Martin Tobin, discussed the evidence when he was expected to take the stand later. The defense gave notice that this was going to be an issue and specifically talked about testing the sample, Cahill said. Even if it's just because Dr. Baker called the state and said, we can actually find this at 8 o'clock this morning, when the defense expert is done testifying, has left the state, he said, referring to Fowler. If he even hints that there are test results the jury has not heard about, it's going to be a mistrial, pure and simple. This late disclosure is not the way we should be operating here, the judge also said. However, the judge said Tobin would be allowed to add information about carbon monoxide in regards to environmental factors when he takes the stand. Dr. Tobin may testify as to carbon monoxide if he sticks to the environmental factors and as a pulmonologist. Looking at the videos, for example, and seeing Mr. Floyd's location and not knowing whether the vehicle is even on or not, which the state brought out in cross-examination, he said. Pat Robertson, Chauvin should be put under the jail. Evangelical media mogul Pat Robertson on Thursday called for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin to be put under the jail for kneeling on George Floyd's neck. During a segment on the 700 Club, Robertson discussed the recent police shooting of Daunte Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, and expressed dismay at the onslaught of police violence. I am pro-police, folks. I think we need the police, we need their service, and they do a good job. But they cannot do this, Robertson said. Derek Chauvin. I mean, they ought to put him under the jail. He has caused so much trouble by kneeling on the neck of George Floyd. It's just terrible what's happening. And the police, why don't they open their eyes to what the public relations are? We've got to stop this stuff. Evangelical media mogul Pat Robertson on Thursday called for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin to be put under the jail for kneeling on George Floyd's neck. During a segment on the 700 Club, Robertson discussed the recent police shooting of Daunte Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, and expressed dismay at the onslaught of police violence. I am pro-police, folks. I think we need the police, we need their service, and they do a good job. But they cannot do this, Robertson said. Derek Chauvin. I mean, they ought to put him under the jail. He has caused so much trouble by kneeling on the neck of George Floyd. It's just terrible what's happening. And the police, why don't they open their eyes to what the public relations are? We've got to stop this stuff. Robertson also took issue with the assessment that Brooklyn Center Police Chief Tim Gannon made of the incident, which is that he believed the officer, Kim Potts, had meant to reach for her taser when she shot and killed Wright. The Christian Broadcasting Network founder then took out a handgun and taser and noted the stark difference in color as well as difference in weight, saying there's no comparison between the two weapons. We don't have the finest in the police department, Robertson said when discussing what could be done to prevent police shootings. He argued that a superior workforce was needed. We need police. We need them and we need to honor them, and I'm all for it, Robertson added. But at the same time, we cannot have a bunch of clowns running around who are underpaid and who really are not the best and brightest. We've got to have the best in there. Robertson, who was a staunch ally to President Trump when he was in office, previously criticized Trump for his law and order response to the unrest that followed Floyd's death. The television host said Trump's threats of military actions against demonstrators was not cool. It seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain, I wanted to comfort you, I think it's time we love each other, Robertson said last year. But the president took a different course. He said, I am the president of law and order, and he issued a heads up. On Thursday, Chauvin's defense team rested in the trial and the court adjourned for the week. Chauvin invoked the Fifth Amendment and declined to testify during the trial on Thursday. Federal judge approves R. Kelly move to New York for sex trafficking trial. A federal judge on Thursday allowed R. Kelly to be relocated from Chicago to New York ahead of his sex trafficking trial, the Associated Press reports. The R&B singer's Brooklyn trial has been pushed back several times as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. U.S. District Judge Ann Donnelly is now saying adequate coronavirus precaution measures are being put into place that will allow the trial to occur on its new scheduled date of August 9. It remains unclear when exactly the musical artist, born Robert Sylvester Kelly, will be transferred. He will likely be held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, the AP reported. Kelly is being tried on charges of sexual assault, kidnapping and a racketeering scheme to provide him with underage victims for sex crimes. He's being charged at the county and federal levels in New York, Illinois, and Minnesota. It was announced in November that he would be tried by an anonymous and partially sequestered jury. Impaneling an anonymous jury is appropriate given the seriousness of the charges, the defendant's history of obstructing the judicial process, the potential for juror intimidation, and the intensity of media attention given to this case, Donnelly wrote of her decision. Kelly has been in custody without bail since his arrest. Hollywood stars, business leaders sign open letter opposing new voting restrictions. A virtual who's who of Hollywood including George Clooney, Queen Latifah, Kerry Washington, Katy Perry, Leonardo DiCaprio and Samuel L. Jackson are adding their names to an open letter condemning voting restrictions, published following the signing of a controversial elections law in Georgia. The letter published Wednesday appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times and other papers as an ad sprawled across 2 full pages. We stand for democracy, the message said in bold letters. As Americans, we know that in our democracy we should not expect to agree on everything, the letter stated. However, regardless of our political affiliations, we believe the very foundation of our electoral process rests upon the ability of each of us to cast our ballots for the candidates of our choice. We all should feel a responsibility to defend the right to vote and to oppose any discriminatory legislation or measures that restrict or prevent any eligible voter from having an equal and fair opportunity to cast a ballot, the letter said. Voting is the lifeblood of our democracy, and we call upon all Americans to join us in taking a nonpartisan stand for this most basic and fundamental right of all Americans, it continued. The letter was also signed by hundreds of major corporations and top executives, including Target, Google, Amazon and Berkshire Hathaway CEO Warren Buffett. Among the performers and entertainment industry figures who signed the letter were Sacha Baron Cohen, Orlando Bloom, J.J. Abrams, Paula Abdul, Naomi Campbell, Lee Daniels, Larry David, Josh Gad, Ariana Grande, Ed Helms, Kate Hudson, Irvin Magic Johnson, Norman Lear, Demi Lovato, George Lucas, Rooney Mara, Lin-Manuel Miranda, Rita Moreno, Gwyneth Paltrow, Joaquin Phoenix, Shonda Rhimes, Tracy Ellis Ross, Mark Ruffalo, and Amy Schumer. The high-profile letter comes after Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, R., signed Republican-backed legislation last month that includes more identification requirements for absentee voters, limits drop boxes and seeks to bar anyone other than poll workers from giving food or water to Georgians waiting in line to cast their ballots. Democrats and voting rights advocates have argued that the law amounts to minority voter suppression. Earlier this week, Will Smith announced that he and Antoine Fuqua, the director of his upcoming project, Emancipation, would move production of the film out of Georgia in protest of the new law. "We cannot in good conscience provide economic support to a government that enacts regressive voting laws that are designed to restrict voter access," Smith and Fuqua said in a joint statement. Multiple other GOP-led states, including Texas, have advanced or are considering new voting reforms after the 2020 election. Brazil's Supreme Court confirms decision to annul Lula convictions. A majority of Brazil's Supreme Court confirmed on Thursday a decision to annul criminal convictions against former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, teeing up a presidential run against current President Jair Bolsonaro in 2022. The decision, which was widely expected, came after Supreme Court Justice Edson Fachin determined in early March that the lower federal court where Lula was tried lacked jurisdiction. A ruling that was quickly appealed by Brazil's top prosecutor. Read more. Lula, 75, governed Latin America's biggest country and largest economy between 2003 and 2011, overseeing a commodities boom that turbocharged economic growth. In 2018, he was convicted of taking bribes from engineering firms in return for public contracts and spent a year and a half behind bars, until the Supreme Court ruled he and others could appeal their cases without serving time. A majority of Brazil's Supreme Court confirmed on Thursday a decision to annul criminal convictions against former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, teeing up a presidential run against current President Jair Bolsonaro in 2022. The decision, which was widely expected, came after Supreme Court Justice Edson Fachin determined in early March that the lower federal court where Lula was tried lacked jurisdiction. A ruling that was quickly appealed by Brazil's top prosecutor. Read more. Lula, 75, governed Latin America's biggest country and largest economy between 2003 and 2011, overseeing a commodities boom that turbocharged economic growth. In 2018, he was convicted of taking bribes from engineering firms in return for public contracts and spent a year and a half behind bars, until the Supreme Court ruled he and others could appeal their cases without serving time. Lula and his supporters blasted the anti-corruption task force that brought him down, called Operation Car Wash, as a politically driven effort. Leaked conversations in 2019 raised questions about whether investigators had cut corners to secure prosecutions. The task force was disbanded in February. With the convictions tossed, Lula is eligible to run once again and is the odds-on favorite among Bolsonaro opponents to take on the right-wing leader in 2022. Early polls show a tight race. Don't forget to comment below with your common sense and subscribe to your podcast. This helps bring the podcast to life and grow it. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We can't wait to continue this adventure with you. Support us on PayPal. Thank you very much and enjoy listening.